Okay, well, Ladson, welcome to this interview for the Journal of Analytical Psychology. And I think amongst your many contributions, you've done a very great deal for the journal. And so the journal is interested really to hear more about you. And I think your long career in psychoanalysis and philosophy, I hope we get to talk about today. And yeah, welcome to the interview, first of all. If you don't mind, I was keen to go right back really to your thesis, which you sent me not that long ago, and which I read. And I was keen if we could begin perhaps with you talking about Husserl and why so early in your life you think he became so important and why you spent quite some time studying him.
Well, it was an interesting transition period in my life when I was preparing to go to medical school. I'd been admitted to medical school, but I was ambivalent whether to stay on in philosophy and literature, which were my core interests for a long time earlier on. But my mentor was Fritz Friedman, who was a friend of Erich Fromm, and he was also very much in the field, they call it then philosophical anthropology. And he was an inspiring teacher, and so I couldn't bear to go on in medical school at the time. I was not finished with philosophy and not really decided whether to become a professor of philosophy or something like that. So in my extra year, the Husserl was just becoming known to the English-speaking world. Phenomenology was still kind of a new enterprise, and so it was refreshing. The Husserl, I was fascinated. I didn't know what Husserl had meant by transcendent, because in the Western tradition, you usually think of transcendent as being kind of a hint of mysticism or something outside the realm of the ordinary human. Whereas Husserl thought of it differently. He re-examined knowledge in the light of Kant. He was kind of a post-Kantian in some ways. Kant, of course, said you can't know the thing in itself, the noumenon, and so phenomenology developed from that. So what can you know? It's more like everyday life, in some sense, to me, phenomenology. But there had only been two things published in English by Husserl, the translations of Husserl, and then there was one thing, Méditation cartésienne, were translated by Levinas, of all people, Cartesian Meditations into English. But the punchline as I found with Husserl, was that by transcendent, he didn't mean some otherworldly kind of knowledge or something beyond, in a sense, beyond the ordinary, but even it's beyond what we can know.
Yes.
It's transcendent to what we know. And so then that leaves you with existence. And of course, then you're talking about existential phenomenology, really. And of course, that leads to Heidegger and so forth and so on. At that time, Heidegger hadn't been much translated into English. It was only translated in English, and Being and Time was in I think 1961, 62, in that time.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a revelation, because a good part of everyday thinking in the academic world and in discourse was based on almost a Platonic system of fixed ideas or whatever that you can know, final principles that might be known. But there was certainly that flavor very much. Whereas phenomenology, as I experienced it with Husserl, was almost meditative. Let come what will. It's more descriptive, meditative, and so forth and so on. And so I wrote my master's thesis on the concept of the transcendent, and that set me off into a whole other way of thinking. Really, So I've never recovered from. I still think it's pretty much the same thing.
It's still there. Yeah. And why Husserl, you think? Why at that time this concept of the transcendent and what what you can't know? Why do you think it was important to you to study then?
Uh, well, I was in a kind of a mixture, undecided where to go into medicine, stay in philosophy or humanities in some way, and I was just generally mixed up, and I had a new romantic relationship, very intense, thinking about marriage, and ended up in marriage too.
Yeah.
And actually, I met my wife in my class on existential problems of literature, where Husserl was first mentioned. So it
Yes.
was a combination of a lot of flux in my life at the time, and being kind of dissatisfied with formal philosophy, which seemed kind of stuffy and repetitious, and same way with the way psychology was taught at that time,
Yeah. Yeah.
which I don't know, hopefully it's improved some. And so it came out of a time of intellectual and personal flux. What I was in my, well, probably it was early 20s, 2021 at that time. And when I first got involved in it. But Husserl, I remember my mentor was teaching this class, Existential Problems in Literature. And he was noteworthy because he was a very independent the guys, Fritz Friedman. He became head of American Studies at the University of Munich, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was just talking away a little bit on the contemporary thought, his thoughts about contemporary philosophies that were emerging. And he just talked a little bit about, he wrote Husserl on the blackboard. And he said, now Husserl, these ideas seem good and new. And of course, he was a German Jew, and he was very acquainted with the emergence of phenomenology and so forth himself. He may have even been to a lecture by Heidegger sometime early on. And so he was very influenced by that school of thought himself. It was purely intuitive, though. It wasn't an immediate take on a certain idea, but the way he talked about Husserl, I thought, a new name. And I felt his own ideas spinning around in his head some way, but then he went off into other things. But that stuck with me, so I started looking up the literature, and then I had to choose what to do a master's thesis on, and I wanted to read more about that world.
And so this also led to an interest in Heidegger. You just said.
Yeah, Husserl was Heidegger's main teacher.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, history of relationship between them later on, Heidegger's flirtations, and more than flirtation, with Nazism, and Husserl being Jewish and so forth.
Yeah.
Displaced, I think, he might have been the chancellor, whatever they called the head of the German the department at the University of, I think it was at, trying to figure which university they were at now. You might remember.
But you decided to study medicine in the end and not philosophy?
Yeah, I finished off my master's thesis in my first summer or two in medical school, actually.
And then you went off, but it was in Stanford, yes, that you studied medicine?
I studied medicine at Washington University in St. Louis.
I see, right.
And so I liked it, especially the clinical part. I didn't like anatomy much, but now I like it better, kind of having learned it. It gives me a better sense of certainly the embodied human being in the literal sense of the word. But I really liked it when I got to clinical studies in medicine, but pretty well. I took a year after medical school. It was required then, if you're going to be a psychiatrist, you had to become qualified in general medicine first. I could have been licensed. I went to Georgetown then for a year just for specialized clinical studies, and I could have practiced general medicine after that. But I figured there's like a handful of maladies in general medicine, if you were familiar with them, like colds, headaches, sprained ankles, so forth and so on. It's pretty repetitious. And then if you got an interesting case, you sent them to a specialist. So I figured general medicine wasn't what I wanted to do. Psychiatry was more intellectually stimulating and just curiosity about the human being and so forth. Actually, my high school advisor met with me way back in high school when I was 16 years old. And my future profession at that time, we discussed, and I'd said, I'd read an article by a psychiatrist on teenage affairs and described me perfectly with all my teenage various preoccupations and so forth. And he said, yes, I think that you're the best fitted in the high school to go on into psychiatry. So I'd sort of flirted with the idea from very early, which was sort of different, I think. But,
yes.
So I kept returning to that. So then I went from Georgetown to Stanford for psychiatry.
For psychiatry, that's why you studied psychiatry, yes.
It was a very great time in psychiatry. They were breaking away from very traditional Freudian approaches, the kind of, rather rigid, trying to make Freud into a dogma, so to speak. And the Strachey translation of Freud being so skewed toward making Freud sound more certain than I think Freud really was, in fact, or in his own writing. But so at Stanford, it was one of the main sources of explorations in family therapy and that sort of thing. And Harry Stack Sullivan was probably the main influence on the psychological approach. I worked a great deal with psychotic patients too, that worked with John Perry, and I met R.D. Lang while I was there. He was a visiting professor, and Gregory Bateson, who was one of the founders of, he invented the double bind theory in schizophrenia and family work.
And Harry Stack Sullivan influenced you too, then?
Oh, he was a big influence. One of his disciples, Don Jackson, was my first supervisor. He had trained with Harry Stack Sullivan for several years, and so he was an immense influence. Don Jackson was like one of these geniuses. In a certain sense, he was so creative, and like he would, if we had a psychotic patient on the ward, he would actually, it's a stereotype, but also true with him. He'd do things. I actually saw him do this. Some patient thought he was some religious figure. I think he thought it was Jesus. And so Don got down on his knee and prayed to him. He said, well, could I say a prayer to you? But it wasn't to be anti-religious, but it was to try to get a dialogue going.
Yeah.
To break through the rigidity in a way of the hallucination and so forth and so on. So I learned that kind of playful engagement kind of thing above the kind of, traditional approaches in psychiatry and to some extent in psychoanalysis at that time. So Don Jackson was a big influence too.
Yes, yes. And this was also a time where, if I'm right, this is where you met Tom Kurz when you were at Stanford.
We were fellow residents, right?
Yeah.
We were in the same resident group of 7 people. There were 14 people in that year, and broken down in 2 groups of 7. And so Tom and I became close friends, naturally. Came from a philosophical background, and his family was so steeped in philosophy and scholarly approaches and so forth. Tom and I became very close friends, and of course he's died a couple of years back, and I've remained quite close with his wife, and we're very. We lived in the same neighborhood actually in Palo Alto. Eventually, lived only a block away from each other. So my kids were older and babysat with his.
Close friendship.
Close friendship. He became much more involved in the political side Jungian stuff, which
Yeah.
drew me so much. I was more into books, articles, lectures, stuff like that.
And was it through Tom Kerrs that you then found your way into the Jungian training and Jungian world and so on?
Yeah, I met his father, who was a fascinating man. He was a real tremendous scholar, seemed to know a little bit of everything. Kind of very dynamic man. Of course, they'd been through the whole refugee experience too, which was, lived in. Tom was actually born in London, as part of the refugee voyage. So Tom and I became very, very close friends and remained friends all through the years. Although our pathways were somewhat different in the Jungian world, because he became so much, he was international president for a couple of terms and worked on establishing the relationship with China and that sort of thing.
Yeah. He was really very involved really with the Jungian world. Yeah. But so this led you into your Jungian analytic training too. Yes. When was that? When did you do this training?
I started analytic training in my last year of residency at Stanford. That was about 1967, 68.
And you finished in the early 70s then, I take it. Yeah.
Then I had to go in the Army. I'd been drafted earlier during the Berlin crisis. And so I agreed to come in later, and that was after my residency. And Tom, at the time, he had a similar thing, but he spent 2 years in the National Health Service. A lot of it was, I think, consulting in Alaska. But Tom and I had taken Kurt Reinhardt was a pretty well-known, he was a German philosopher and historian. He wrote the standard history of Germany, I think still used, and called Germany 2000 Years. But he had taken classes with seminars with Heidegger. He was the first Catholic philosopher, or first Catholic at Stanford. It's hard to think of those times, but they were still suspicious of Catholics being under control of the Pope and speaking for the Pope. He would joke about it. I mean, Kurt was a great guy, but Tom and I, for our elective in our last year of training at Stanford, spent time with him every other week, a morning every other week, reading over Being and Time that had just recently come out in translation. Read Kierkegaard. I think those are the main two things. We spent a full year meeting with Kurt Reinhardt. That was it really reinforced my interest in existentialism, existential phenomenology.
Yeah.
So by the time I ever encountered Jung, I was already kind of very much had a bit my own point of view with more existential phenomenology, but the archetype always seemed a bit regressive to me and too absolute and fixed in some way.
Yeah, it was, what I was thinking is that I remember we talked about it once, that it was still a time in which you could study Jung, where many of the people who taught you had themselves been in contact with Jung or had some analysis or some supervision with him.
I'd say the majority probably. Joe Henderson, Joe Wheelwright. My own first analyst was John Perry, who later got into all the problems with sexuality with his patients and stuff, but he was a wonderful teacher and analyst. I didn't know about all that later, but Joe Wheelwright, Joe Henderson, most of them had some supervision and some, of course, extensive analysis with Jung. So Jung was very alive, and there was great openness at that time. It hadn't become an establishment. They were just kind of getting their feet in America, I think, in some more basic way. Whereas the Freudians were much more the establishment.
And did it, because you then did that training, did it, yeah, I want to say, did it fit, with the philosophy you had studied? I mean, how did it go? I was thinking just about the comment you made about the archetype, and yeah, did that go hand in hand, or how was that?
Well, I think at first it made me not feel like I didn't fit in, and went through a lot of self-doubt the first year of analytic training. Like, I must just not really be getting the archetype like other people
Mm-hmm.
do. Like, it just didn't quite ring true for me. It just seemed, they're extraordinary experiences that, to greater or lesser degree, we all have time to time in our life. But to call it archetypal seemed to be diminishing it, like the real true self in heaven, someplace, or, with this the circle of a special circle of Illuminati somewhere. And I always had, I think I'm at core was existential phenomenology spoke to me
Yeah.
and continued to through the years. So I felt a little bit on the outside, although I was always well treated and I thought people were quite generous and I had great clinical supervision. The clinical part of my experience was really quite outstanding. The intellectual part, I think in training was not as good as I'd had earlier on. Could be shades of gray though. I mean, it wasn't like black and white that way. So intellectual stimulation more came from the outside, and I tried to assimilate the Jungian ideas as best I could do that.
Yes. But of course there is in the training that there is, of course, on the one hand, the thinking about the theory, but there was also, I assume, the clinical training and seeing patients and yeah.
I like the approach. It was, very humanistic, very accepting of the experience and honoring the subjective experience,
Mm.
so forth and so on. There's a generosity of spirit, and too, all the newness. Everything was new. The training was experimental and new, and Jungians hadn't been around that long as a group. Psychoanalysis was a bit older and more entrenched, and so I found the atmosphere quite. It was kind of after finished my first year. The first year was preliminary,
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco Institute, and so you had to. They had a joint board between LA, Los Angeles, and San Francisco to say you're okay to go on for another year, whether you wanted to for further years. And so I had a great conversation with the committee, and everything was fine. We were all happy with each other and all that stuff. So I thought I was really calm and everything. And I opened the door and I walked into a closet. And so the conclusion of that, we all just laughed hilariously. And so I told them, I said, well, I guess I was more nervous than I thought I was. But they were quite receptive, and we laughed and talked, for a couple of minutes afterwards. So that gives you an idea of the spirit of it, though. It's
Yeah.
really nice spirit in those early days.
Do you think that these? I mean, it is a bit of a jump ahead, really, but that tension between the Jungian thinking and your philosophical interest, really. That in the end also led to the formation of the new school, the new school of analytical psychology. Did that house more that philosophical thinking, really?
Yeah, of course, that took many years, but the new school was an attempt to really get back to the roots of existential phenomenology, include cultural and political concerns, and also deeper ethical concerns. Uh, I think my final summation of my concern that way was in John Mills's book on Jung and philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
published 3 or 4 years ago. I wrote an article called, I think, Jung, Time, and Ethics, something like that. But the whole idea was that archetypes are about the eternal. And I thought that my thesis, which I still feel, is that denigrates the everyday in terms of something transcendent in the sense of being beyond what we can know in a fixed kind of way, like a Platonic idea.
Yeah.
But having the opposite approach, that great ideas emerge out of everyday human experience. Humans have the same bodies, the same everyday concerns, and how we grapple with that, and have through the 3 million year history of the species as it slowly emerged. There weren't some archetypes out there kind of innate and deciding things that grew out of human experience in the everyday sense, and the sense of cultural evolution and the accumulation of cultural memories, which I think Jung valued the cultural memories a great deal, but then he would refer to the expression of archetypes. Why don't you, my thought was, leave the archetypes out? And I thought that really cut short the creativity, actually, somewhat in the Jungian world, that you see a justification like, oh, well, they finally got to the archetype, if it was clinical work. But then the archetype came. And that was a more traditional Jungian. There were a lot of different kinds of Jungians, and many were experimenting with their own approaches too, but favoring the timeless over the course of time. Human beings in their own temporality lived from day to day and so forth. And also, I'd had a dream very early in my training, was that Joe Wheelwright, who was a big figure in the early Jungian world, and of course he and his wife Jane had spent time with Jung in the early days in Zurich, and they both been very close with Jung. I think mainly helping deal with her alcoholic brother, but then they got really into their own analysis, and Joe Wheelwright was one of the co-founders of the Jung Institute in San Francisco, but he was a very extroverted, gregarious, open kind of guy. And I was at a guest house with Joe Wheelwright and with Jung. We were having a beer together. And Jung looked very sad. And I looked over and I said, "Well, what's the matter, Carl? You look unhappy." And he said, "Oh, I need somebody to translate my works into American." And he said American as though noteworthy, not into British or English, into American, which I thought the old pragmatic American, down, the good side of the American spirit, you might say. The pioneer spirit, thinking things anew, there are many sides of America which have all too evident in recent times, especially. But,
yes.
So that was that dream. I think it was an expression of how I was feeling. I never was antagonistic toward the Jungian world or Jungians in particular. It was never took on that turn, except, once in a while I find somebody I thought was a bit on the rigid side, but might get in a debate with them about archetypes and the noumenon and phenomenon.
Yeah.
So yeah, many of my early teachers, I'd say the majority had either analysis or supervision from Jung. My own analyst had some supervision.
Yeah. The connection was still very close to Zurich. Yeah. Just I was thinking about what you have thought and written about a great deal, and one of your first papers is false foolery and feeling foolish, and there's lots of work around shame. But just thinking about that first paper, I was just wonder if you could say a bit more about it, how you arrived at that topic, which has seemed to be an important topic throughout your professional thinking. I think you've really focused a great deal on shame.
Yeah, that's it was a multi-determined kind of thing, I think, that it's often hard to pick up the exact threads. But, I think growing up as I was the only male in a fairly extended family and the oldest both. And I always had done well in school and so forth. And so I had so many expectations of being perfect. And I ran into my first great difficulty with being perfect is I was unable to do public speaking in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel paralyzed and I couldn't proceed. And as it turned out later, it was shame issues that go into my own analysis. So shame was very crucial in my own development.
Mm-hmm.
And saying shame, things, I fear that things that were not so perfect might spill out, when I was in public, when I was, giving a spiel of some kind, a little talk or so forth. And I mastered that actually in medical school, well, more in internship and clinical work. I had to present so often, cases of people who died due to medical accidents and different things, not my accident, but other people. The intern was stuck with presenting problematic cases to maybe 50 or 100 people who were medical school faculty and people in training and so forth. And so I had to do that in order to get a medical license. So I just had to grit my teeth and do it. Somehow pretty much overcame the sense of shame, but I always reflected on it because that was a great defeat for me at the time. They had to drop out of class, as a late adolescence. It was a shame issue. And so then I began to reflect on that, stuck in my mind. And so I thought, yeah, but you do have to feel shame because when you get into the unknown and you feel inadequate to the situation for inner or outer reasons, you experience shame. So the shame is you might say that always there with individuation because you always rock the boat by what you have to do or what your own emotions compel you to do. But anytime you get into new territory, you feel shame and uncertainty. And in a way, it saves you, though, and helps you keep boundaries, proper shame. But so my interest, continued. I got into Kohut later on. That was in the 70s. Heinz Kohut, originator of self-psychology. I saw in the National Psychiatric Journal, he was given, in those days they had a correspondence courses. And he was giving a correspondence course, and it's called self-psychology. And I thought, oh, well, that sounds interesting. And I was quite influenced by that, that many people were. It's close to Jung. They talked about the self as being formed out of experience, but had some of the qualities of openness and so forth that the best of Jungian stuff has, I think. And but shame when you get overexcited is a primary, called the narcissistic grandiose self. It gets so overexcited. There's a sense of kind of loss of sense of boundaries, and not fragmentation would be too strong usually, but some sense of then disorganization of the sense of self. But seeing the shame is probably the main emotion that's important, at least according to Kohut at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So when I did my first major paper at International in late 70s, that was in San Francisco, the subject was on shame, and I've been influenced by William Williford, who was a professor of literature, but he wrote on Shakespeare and shame, I think called The King and His Scepter or something like that. It was quite an interesting book. And so I went into Native American concerns about shame and proper behavior, proper in the sense of not being grandiose or destructive, but that proper shame and respect, for the other, for tradition and so forth. So it's probably shame goes back, I think, even in the pre-verbal times in the character, but my most dramatic notable point with shame was back in the teenage kind of experience of being unable to give public lectures or perform in class on speech and elocution, you might say.
But later you write about shame as a teacher, really, that
Right.
you see it as something that people can really use to develop, and by reflection and so on.
Yeah, I gave a paper called "Shame as a Teacher" in the late night. It was international meeting in Zurich. It was deemed the premillennial kind of focus, premillennial, and I saw shame as already being kind of lacking or not being avoided, both in psychology and in culture in general, and lack of respect for deep values was growing, which to me then the culmination in the US was Trump, but I think there was a sense already of looming cultural crises at the time of the millennium. So I thought it was appropriate to bring back the whole idea of shame teaches us our proper boundaries. And without its real discourse isn't possible without a sense of humility, our own limitations, that sort of thing. The shame and humility, to me, quite favorable virtues for the continuity of civilization.
Yeah, quite not quite for an individual, but also really for the collective, for the society as well. What you're saying.
Right. Well, Aristotle, I know, wrote about shame a little bit. I think in Greek it's eidos or eidos. I don't know how you pronounce it. AIDOS in the English. But Aristotle said the basic unit of Greek government was the police. The small governmental unit. But he said the police couldn't function in its proper way for the good of society and law and so forth and justice without proper shame. You couldn't even begin to have a culturally significant, ethically significant discourse without there already being proper shame. Not to be filled with shame, and of course with deep trauma, terrible shame can happen and so forth.
So would you say that currently, in our day-to-day life now, as we know it, society and something collective is struggling with that, with being aware of its shame?
Definitely. You could say that Donald Trump is the incarnation of the archetype of shamelessness.
Yeah.
With the new school, to me, then you get back to the ethical purpose of shame, humility, slowing down, being able to see the viewpoints of others, and not psychopathic arrogance or self-serving things, but kind of respect for others and others' ideas and so forth and so on.
Yeah. How did, just thinking about some of the books you've been working on, how did temporality come alongside that concept of shame in your work?
Well, I think, of course, it goes partly back to, of course, Heidegger wrote Being and Time. So it's a little bit more theoretical, but very profound, I think. Temporality is something we know about, but we don't think about very much. But I think to be in the world in time is the ethical position, whereas timelessness, as I was saying, like the timeless archetype seemed to me almost being without shame, because you're saying you have a conduit to the eternal. But the eternal is not time. It's not temporality is the experience of everyday time.
Yes.
Human experience. Whereas timelessness, Jung was inclined substantially, and I traced in his seminars, usually his great preference for the timeless. He was always looking for, there's the archetype.
Mhm.
It could be his own earlier crises, I think, as Pareto wrote about in Requiem for Analytical Psychology. He felt Jung never got past that, uh, past the final boundary in a certain kind of exploration, even though Pareto didn't talk about time. I saw that as his own immersion of clinging to the timeless dimension and not launching in some way into the everyday experience of the human and valuing that in a primary way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So time is kind of tied up with ethics, and my interest in ethics through my immersion in shame, but then I sought to become a human creature in the fullest sense, or succumb, of course, ultimately with existentialism and so forth, succumb to fear of death, or we all succumb to death. And that's the universal particular, so to speak. Of course, first evidence of human culture was around, burial and graves and so forth. No one can quite date that, maybe 300,000 BC or so forth. So the temporality seemed to be very connected with awareness and reflection on the course of human experience in the everyday sense. Being toward death is time, temporality.
Yes. No, I was just thinking about it, and you're bringing that shame and temporality together, and that there is something about it much more in the moment. And I was thinking about Freud's death drive, and just the idea of some sort of loss of hope, really, that may be more real in the world right now. Would you see it like that?
No, the death drive, boy, that's a complex subject.
It is.
Yeah, yeah. I like the death drive. I like the part of when he talked about the primeval swamp or whatever he did.
Mm-hmm.
That the first creatures of any kind that emerged, the little multicellular creatures or whatever they were, their main problem was to assimilate or integrate the world around them, the chemical soup around them, and to maintain their boundaries so they wouldn't exist anymore. And then there's the other urge that's hard work to maintain those boundaries, and the urge to, kind of just the hell with it, it's too much work.
Yes, yes.
And yet, without breaking the boundaries, there would be no evolution. And I look on that as a death drive, the kind of ambivalence about destruction and creation. So that's the way I look at the death drive, and I think that's a very elemental thing. And I think, to me, all the more profound schools of analytic thought, or maybe all thought, they don't deal with. They have to. That's be what I hope the new school people will reflect on: creation and destruction. But what are kind of the origins of that? What and so part of Freud's discussion of the death drive, which took various forms later on, that the part that stuck with me were the kind of the original or the origins of organic life. In some way, the whole war between structure and breaking down structure for the sake of the new to occur.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But quite important still. This.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, we're still struggling with that for sure. Everything seems to be breaking down so much,
Mm-hmm.
And that shame is trying to more conserving.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah.
It can be a terrible emotion when there's so much destruction. Everything seems loaded with shame, like aggression. If you don't have any aggression, you're not alive. You'll
Mm-hmm.
perish quickly. But too much aggression's very destructive. So, of course, that's where ethics comes in too.
And I suppose it is where your work on Stiegler comes in too, the very current society and the I had to think about the idea of symbolic misery and his work around giving technology and people a place really, and yeah, the loss of individuality.
Stigler's sort of a, yeah, he's so many-sided. He's mastered so many, areas of thought. But also I deeply respect him because, of course, he was a bank robber and spent time in prison where he had to he thought he had to totally reconstitute himself or go insane. And so all he did, evidently French prisons are more beneficial than American prisons.
Mm.
But he was able to get books and have his own cell. He went on a hunger strike to get his own cell in the French prison so that he could focus and read all the time. And he reconstructed himself. And then when he was released, he went directly into advanced doctoral studies at, I think, I can't remember who his advisor was. Was Derrida or something? I think it was Derrida was one of his main advisors. Yeah, but he had anthropology, evolutionary studies, history. I know his main cohort, his translator and younger friend, Dan Ross, they have a very deep connection with psychoanalysis, and they're very interested in Laplanche, but also Winnicott, and the whole idea in Winnicott of the world of the imagination and creation is the basic human thing. The use of the object, you might say, in a way of creativity and imagination. But Stigler had this multidisciplinary approach. He was very interested in evolutionary psychology, the origins of the little human creature from 3 million years ago, and development of tools and fix of memory. In particular, he talked about exteriorization of memory, which we might call culture, but that's more, I think, culture is a little more abstract than memory is a total sense. But of course, the brain can only contain so much unless you have externalized sources of memory. That's wouldn't be quite human. So I saw Stigler combine philosophy, psychoanalysis, evolutionary psychology, history, kind of all these different disciplines. And I think it makes him difficult for some people to read, but at the same time, it seems like he was put forth one of the great syntheses of our times, which hopefully will be carried further. I see there's a whole upsurge of articles inspired by his work already since he just died a year or so ago.
And just the relevance of his work for what goes on in the world right now, how you see that as quite important, I know.
I do. I think it's the first kind of attempt at a new synthesis. After the postmodern and so forth. He's certainly not a destructive postmodernist, and yet he keeps some of the alive qualities of postmodernism.
Yeah.
Seeing the way Derrida, was not a destructive thinker. He wasn't, you might say, a nihilist in any way, but he was always saying the truth is à venir, to come. So Zukunft, it's always to come. And so he keeps that quality, but he includes that then with the primary human origins, always something new to come, that the precursor, or maybe simultaneously with any kind of thought or evolution, has to do with the thread of the future and temporality. That's how I got interested in Stigler to start with, because his primary works are called Techniques in Time.
Yeah.
How technology and time, what you can do with this rock is not just throw it at the dinosaur that's pursuing you or something, or whatever there might have been back then. But it was, well, what you could do with that rock in various ways. You cannot just throw it at an animal or so forth. But, you can begin to invent and imagine, but that's always anticipating, which implies a sense of future There's, the paleoanthropology and paleoarchaeology can see the changes in the brain itself, of course, over the especially 3 million years up until Paleolithic times when the brain was kind of at its max. I think our brains now, the brain case isn't as large as it was then, in the Paleolithic times. Went down a bit in the Neolithic times. Evidently, it was harder for the human being in the first few thousand years of so-called civilization and written language. The human state of the human went downwards. It showed more signs of malnutrition, body size and skull size seemed to diminish. And then in more recent decades, it's come back up to what it was in Paleolithic times, which is kind of an interesting social phenomenon we could speculate on. Civilization wasn't too good for the human for a while. So-called, culture and civilization, settled cities of large size and so forth.
Yeah. He writes lots about this connection with technology, the person's connection with technology and I mean the tool you just referred to, but this importance really of technology we have around us, the very connection away perhaps from the more human connection.
Yeah, technology. Heidegger was probably more suspicious of technology than Stigler. Stigler, with Heidegger, you almost got a binary kind of thing with technology. Whereas with Stigler, he sees technology as being the essence of the human without tools, time, sense of future. That what we know as the human is essentially technology. If you take technology in the very broadest sense, is technos. He calls it technos. That includes language, tools, all memory devices, everything we consider quote culture, but in a much more down to earth kind of sense. So that he would see, no, the human is technos, and that's the essential part of us. And without that, we wouldn't be what we call human even.
No, right.
And so he's not, so many binaries involved with many people's thinking about technology, like it's this alien thing that's kind of thrust upon us somehow, or rather than, it's a problem. And Stigler uses the principle he calls it the pharmacon, which the basic idea is that everything is both poison and cure, and technology is both poison and cure. And it's a human ethical responsibility to try to look to the curative or positive sides, the humanly enhancing side of technology. But that's the essential human. It's not technology as this kind of alien thing from another planet or something that
No.
Planet. So much of talk about technology is kind of a romantic rebellion and saying, "Oh, technology is terrible. Look at all it's doing to us." Well, it's doing stuff to us, but it's also what makes us human. And like right now, I have hearing aids on, glasses. I take several pills. Might not probably wouldn't even be alive or not nearly as functional if it wasn't for technology. I drive the car around still.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's writing and books and language and all those things. I mean, the human that wouldn't be human if it wasn't for all that. I think there's a weird forgetfulness that people have about how technological we are in the broader sense that tends to get lost in a lot of almost romantically inspired discussions of some loss of some perfection that we used to have. We never had perfection, Like Stigler wrote a long thing against reasoning of Rousseau, the perfect state of nature. Well, there wasn't any, Nature was always hard as hell, and the humans were good at making something that we call the human civilization out of that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here and with you. And certainly personally appreciate so much Hessel and to Journal of Analytical Psychology. I'll pass on the little dribs and drabs of things that I've experienced. If it's helped others or informative in some way, I'll be very, very happy if that could be.
Oh, well, it's been great to have you, Ladson. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.